remote. So I'm sure he sends his regards, but needs to work remote. And he has asked us to just lead through the agenda. We also have the consultants joining us today. But what I was wanting us to start with is to just thank you all for getting back together with us. We had a 1 month dip and hiatus there, but we're going to be working, adding a few more meetings and having a lot of material to go through in the next several months or so. So really appreciate your flexibility, and thank you that you found us today. A shift in hours also. One more person coming in here. Hi. Yes, you found us. And also, you know, that new space, I mean, it won't always be here, but getting familiar with some of the city facilities is okay. So I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us in both either remote or in person. And before we really get going, let's start with a round of introductions, because I think we still continue to see some folks we might not have seen for a while. I'll just start with myself, since I started talking right away, but then move us over to all the CAG members and bring us back to the team from there. So again, I'm Lavelle Means, manager of the community planning section. Let's go through the room here, and then to guests on screen, and then staff and our consultants. So do you want to start, Chris?
I'm Chris Chitty. I'm a local builder.
Hi, Justin Metcalf, I'm a developer.
Tim Pham, I'm on the planning board.
Ryan Salisbury, excuse me, I'm with WGM Group, a civil engineer at WGM.
My name is Bob Giordano. I direct Missoula Institute for Sustainable Transportation. That includes the Free Cycle Community Bike Program, and I'm the chair of the Rattlesnake Transportation Committee also.
So CAG members on screen, remote. Should we just go down? Can you hit the list maybe? Yeah. We'll start by just working down the list. Alan, Adam.
So it's far away for us on that
Adam.
Adam Hertz, I'm a realtor and developer and former member of the city council.
And Alan.
Alan McCormick, attorney with Garlington Lana Robinson.
And then Brian.
Brian Von Lassberg, former city council member, and do some clean energy consulting.
Kat.
I am Kat Cowley. I'm the director of the on-campus basic needs program.
And Heather.
Heather McMillan with Homeward Project Development Director.
Leslie. Leslie, we're waiting for you to unmute. Yes, we can come back to you. I think that is everyone in that is virtual from the CAG group. So let's come back to staff and our community here.
Are we going to do consultants?
Consultants as well, yes. Let's stay up in your world then. Back up there on the screen, we have the consultant team joining us, and I saw Sam. Yep, there. Sam, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Lavelle. Sam Suter, I'm owner of Meta Urban Design, and I'm the project manager on this project. Peter, you want to go next?
Good morning, everyone. Peter Park, I'm the principal in charge on the project.
Jamin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. David Kimball from Cascadia Partners. We can round out the consultant team. We do a lot of the more analytical parts of the work here.
Thank you. So what do we have? Let's please. And Ben.
I'll jump in. Hi, everyone. Ben Brewer, planning supervisor and a project manager on the project. And yeah, apologies to not be there today in person. Have some of the sickness going around my family, so I'm staying home.
Okay. So far, I'm not seeing any, but we have a place for public comment on the agenda. And then locally here in the room?
Yeah, I'm Ashley Brittner Wells. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the community engagement specialist for CPDI and the Missoula project.
Erin Payton, the director of community planning, development, and innovation.
We're trying to work out some technical glitches for Leslie.
Yep, so so Leslie will just be using chat, it sounds like. So we'll watch the chat.
Thank you.
Comments or questions.
Is there anybody else in the participants list or the people's list that we've missed?
No, I don't think so. Not at all.
So I should have also said, and reminded me of this and I forgot, but we are recording this and then making it available for some of the folks that have missed, you know. So without any, if there are no objections, we would start the recording.
Oh, I already did, Val. We're rolling. Thanks.
Yeah.
But thanks for that reminder. And yep, these are available to us all to watch after or visit after. And for those of you who aren't able to be here at the meeting today, yep, hope that people can take the opportunity to go back and see what the conversation is.
Great.
Ben, how do we and where do we access the recordings? Because I did miss the last meeting.
There's a YouTube channel.
He's looking into it.
Yeah.
And there's a link back in there. I'll probably have to send that again.
Yeah, we can get that link sent out again. I'll make a note of that.
Because I clicked on the questionnaire and it wouldn't let me in the questionnaire.
Okay. So we'll follow up with that link for everyone.
Okay. So
I don't see any public, so.
This is public comment on items not on the agenda.
I don't think we have any public, so.
Okay. Well, let's move on. Before we work through the old business items and new business, I just wanted to also provide an update on what's been going on with implementing, bringing in the state mandated bills. So if you're not aware, the council approved amendments to the subdivision regulations and the zoning code update amendments about 10 days ago. These implement 13 state land use bills and will feed into streamlining more project reviews, introduce another expedited subdivision review process for minor subdivisions. They remove a few requirements for TED proposals. Related to TED proposals, it reduces the parking requirement for multi-dwelling units in the commercial districts. It repeals the design review board and removes or revises several design standards. There was a lot in these amendments that helped to further the goals of the Our Missoula project. The Engage Missoula page has the more detailed information about the amendments. It also has links to the final documents there. If you want to keep that up to date or check that out, go to Engage Missoula and you can find it pretty easily. So now we're starting to look at what would be included in the second phase of the code changes that are primarily spurred on from the state bills. And based on consultation with the council leadership and the administration, and what we know through this process, we are going to take a more targeted approach on those amendments. Our plan is to implement the two other state bills that are come effective January 1st, related to allowing the duplex units on city lots and the bill about ADUs in this phase. These two additional bills really deliver a lot of potential for change in the community. Other amendments that we include will be very targeted and focused. As we mentioned a few months ago, the idea is to identify some limited amendments that can stand alone, can be based on existing policy, and solidly not have any unintended consequences while we comprehensively work through our Missoula project. Keeping the space targeted to changes included in state legislation, those two bills. Administrative cleanup and implementation steps already called for in adopted plans removes the necessity of a comprehensive engagement process at this stage in the project. Guidance from council and the mayor's office is to keep our eyes on the final product, the creation of the UDC, the Unified Development Code, and to deliver a narrower set of code amendments in phase 2 through this more targeted approach. Early findings from engagement support a more targeted approach as well. As we know, Missoula residents care about land use principles in this project overall. It would be a risk to make any substantive changes without taking the holistic picture into account. And just as we've highlighted through the whole process, the community has to be a part of that conversation. So I just want to stress that we will have a better product in the long run if we continue to keep the bulk of our attention and focus on the comprehensive project. And, you know, we can keep you updated on that. This second phase of state mandated bills as we go. So just keeping that in mind, see if you have any questions. And then we'll move into other old business.
The ADU one, I think I misheard the 2 meetings ago. I thought you had said there would be 1,000 square foot minimum. And that really struck me. And I look back and I think it's maximum.
Yeah.
So if that's what the legislature said, we're going to adopt this, and anyone in the city of Missoula can convert a garage or build 1,000 square foot or under. And I know there's another requirement too.
Yeah.
It can't be bigger than certain square feet.
Percentage of.
Yeah. ADU by right in any neighborhood. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the baseline that the state provided.
Is there a chance that we just adopt 1,000 square feet without the proportion of the single family encumbering it?
I think we'd have to look at whether there's any unintended consequences to that, but we'll just, you know, we're going to start with what the base is. And then also just keep in mind that the broader code reform project will continue to have that conversation too.
Will there be a minimum?
There has been a minimum. I mean, okay, will there be a minimum? The language, I don't have the language in front of me, but it's like, if, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there has to be.
The state language doesn't have any minimum
Right.
language.
Yeah.
It would only be building code.
Yeah.
To me, this is one of the most exciting things ever. And we could build a lot of 200 to 400 square foot cottages. We could convert garages. We could.
Well, we can already do that. We can go up to 600 now.
Yeah.
The thing that this changes is it gets us from 6 to 1,000.
Okay, okay.
And that 6 to 1,000 allows us to that really helps in getting something that is more marketable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there are other elements of the bill, as you know, from the last batch of amendments. We also removed some design standards, some of them in the ADU section as well. But this bill also talks about removing, specifically dedicated to ADUs, talks about removing standards and indicates that we need to treat those standards the same way we would treat single dwelling standards. So I think you'll see some other changes related to height, let's say, or more cleanup around the design standards if we didn't remove them entirely because of the past bills. So there's more work to go into it, and we'll be studying it. We'll be, using that as the baseline and then, rolling it out. I'll just caution that even though these are bills that become effective January 1st, our agencies will have to use that language, but the process for this will probably take a little longer. I mean, just like what we did with the last one, but even longer than that, I think, to actually get it all put together and implemented. As I mentioned in the last presentation, it was going to be, you know, late winter, early spring when it's actually through the approval
But
process.
if we get an ADU application on January 1st,
We
we
have
have
to
to review
use
it
state
through
language.
the new, even if council hasn't yet adopted it.
So it behooves us to get as close and as in line with what the, you know, what the intent was as quickly as we can.
Hey, everybody, I'm just gonna jump in here and say, and I think to stay on track for timing for the meeting, we probably just have another minute or two on to stay on this, and then we should probably transition to the next topic. And just to emphasize what Laval's saying, that this is work in progress, and we'll be working through these types of questions to figure out what the specific code needs to say, and we'll say and should say, and we'll be providing updates on that as we go.
Yeah, we'll come back to this topic a lot next.
Okay, two quick follow-ups. So anywhere in the city of Missoula, in every neighborhood, this is allowed right now up to 600 feet. This bill would say continue everywhere in the city of Missoula up to 1,000, and then we're getting rid of the parking requirement.
We already did,
Fireman's gone.
and it is already allowed in all zoning districts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just not 10 parcels or non-conforming parcels.
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Okay, let's shift over to a overview of the equity work that's been going on. Just kind of reminding you that we brought a presentation to this group in May. And we wanted to have some time for you all to sit with that material, reflect on it, talk with others about it, and circle back here for a deeper conversation. So that's a primary point of coming back to equity and land use. But so we've got a couple components of that right now. First, we were going to hear from Ashley talking about what kind of community engagement update you have for what we've been hearing from the community over the past several months. And then we're going to hand it over to Jamin from there to lead us through the discussion. So,
yeah,
Ashley,
do we
you
have
wanna
the
take it
slides? Awesome. Okay, so I just wanted to go over a little bit of all of the engagement that we've done since the kickoff last December. And so for phase 1 engagement, we did our community kickoff with Common Good Missoula at the fairgrounds and grounded the community in what our Missoula means for all of us, and to hopefully stay engaged in the process through the next year and a half or so, and how diverse, inclusive, and robust engagement can guide how Missoula will grow in the future. We had an attendance of over 250 residents at that event. So that was very successful and exciting. Next slide. For phase 2 and the equity and land use information, since April presented, we did 19 presentations to different stakeholder groups, including one large community-wide event that we held in September. We did 19 tabling events and 10 table talks in partnership with Common Good Missoula. And thank you to Bob for letting us host the River Road table talk and neighborhood meeting at Free Cycles. It's very generous and garnered a lot of attendance from neighbors, which was really exciting. Through those efforts, since April and over the summer into September, we reached over 900 residents with our efforts, and so that was ultimately very successful as well. Next slide. Through the outreach that we did, we were asking questions around housing affordability, displacement and gentrification, and others to garner folks' experiences and just make sure that the information in the equity and land use was resonating with residents, that it sort of matched what folks were experiencing in the community. And the top 5 themes that We heard from that engagement or housing affordability and accessibility, transportation and infrastructure, community safety and diversity, environmental and climate concerns, and land use, built form, and development. And so from here, I think we're going to talk a little bit about just revisit some of the information from the equity and land use report to hear from you all about what you think as well. Thank you. Of course. Any questions or anything? Pretty straightforward. Thanks.
So let's hand it to Jamin, right? I think you're the one guiding us through the discussion.
Yeah, and let me get the sharing back up. I think it was cutting off part of the screen or it wasn't working quite properly. So retry it here and make sure you all can see the whole slides. So, okay, how does that look?
We can see them.
It's good.
Okay, good. Great. So, yeah, as Laval mentioned, back in May, we presented to you kind of a summary of the equity and land use report. And since that time, there have been quite a bit of community outreach done to talk about what that might mean for the growth policy update and the code reform projects. But we wanted to have some time here to come back and to see if you have more questions or comments or other ways you want to try to better understand what this work, how it's going to inform the Our Missoula project. And so I just have a few slides here to kind of remind you of some of the content of that report and the key takeaways. And then I have a couple of specific kind of discussion prompts that we'd love to get your response on. But this one just is like, if we tried to boil down the 70-some page analysis that is that equity and land use report, these are the kind of 7 bullets of the key takeaways. And so I won't go through this again now, but we can come back to this if you want kind of a reminder of like what should we take away from that analysis and how we might think about it, how it will inform the code project. There's also at the end of the report, it's kind of concludes with these principles for the code reform project. And so the idea here is that these are some key kind of concepts that we should keep in mind as we go about this work of somewhat reimagining some of the way that the city regulates development, and particularly regulates housing development. And so these are some really key ideas that we can come back to if you want to talk about those. But there's a couple of specific components and like elements of equity as it relates to land use that we wanted to also ask you specifically about. So let me go ahead and get into those. And so the first one is relates to this idea of where are the neighborhoods that would be most advantageous to encourage more housing for the sake of it would, if new housing was developed there, and particularly more affordable housing types, it would improve kind of access to amenities and services and opportunities, and it would make that a more equitably distributed across the city. And so you get more people living in close proximity to the kind of characteristics of a neighborhood that make that a nice place to live and also a livable place, and connect you to jobs, connect you to schools and parks and things that kind of complete your quality of life. And so the residential suitability index is one way that the city has tried to measure this in the past, and it takes multiple different features of a neighborhood and gives them a score
and then ranks them in terms of, or ranks particular locations based on whether they have good access to all those features. So those are things like commercial areas, grocery stores, and so on. And so the question here is, when you look at this map, first off, does the mapping make sense to you? And so like the darker green areas here, do you agree those are areas that it would be that the city should be encouraging housing the most? Those are places that already have good access to those services and amenities. And then, following from that, do you think actually encouraging housing in those places would improve social equity outcomes? So we're giving more people the chance to live in those neighborhoods that have that good access to services and amenities. So that's one question there. I want to also get to a related analysis that we did, which is taking a little different tact at the same question, which is we also know that where someone lives and the neighborhood they live in has a pretty strong impact on their economic outcomes, and particularly for lower income households, and particularly for children, the neighborhood they grow up in has long-term impacts on their economic outcomes later in life. And so with that in mind, we pulled together a index which looks at different indicators of socioeconomic status in the neighborhood and economic outcomes in different neighborhoods. And that's what this is called here. What you're seeing, this map here, is the Economic and Educational Opportunity Index. And so the idea here is, should the city try to think about encouraging housing in these neighborhoods where, if a lower income household was able to live in that neighborhood, that may have a positive impact on their economic outcomes, either in the short term and especially for children in the long term. And so what this measures is things like, you'll have a higher score on this index if the neighborhood has a lower poverty rate, if there's a higher rate of educational attainment among the current population that lives there, there's a higher rate of employment among the current population, higher graduation rate among the local high schools, and then higher test scores at the local schools. So these are indicators that academic research has been shown to be associated with improving economic outcomes for lower income households. So question here is this, how do you think this data should inform the code reform project? What do you think about using these kinds of indicators as a guide to where new housing should be encouraged? So I want to pause there for questions, because this index and the suitability index are asking kind of similar questions. I'm just curious your thoughts on this bigger policy question of, where should we encourage housing to help make sure we're better meeting our equity goals? So any thoughts, any questions, comments on these analyses?
Do you have an overlay?
Where overlay both of these?
Yeah.
We don't actually, but that is something we have done in other projects, and it is useful to look at where all of these factors overlay, and that may give you even more impetus for looking particularly at certain areas. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, we don't, but I think that's something we could produce in the later stages of this, or the next stages of this project. We'll be using some of this data when we start to evaluate the impact of potential code changes. And so we have alternatives or scenarios developed. We'll then use some of this data to say, okay, how would that code change, for example, increase housing capacity in high opportunity neighborhoods. And so that's one way we can use this going forward, and we could overlay and combine multiple of these indicators to get a bigger picture of the impacts of a code change as it changes where housing is allowed in different geographies of the city.
I think Kat has a question.
So if you see that, Jamin in the chat, is there a side-by-side of both maps?
We just answered that question.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, you know what, and just an observation is there's some areas where high suitability and high opportunity definitely overlap here. There's other areas where it on this index ranks as high opportunity, but it ranks low on high suitability. And so, because it's measuring different things, but yes, side by side or an overlay, I think would be helpful. But at this stage, we're keeping them separate because it's a different way of thinking about, in terms of policy, where should the city encourage housing? What factors should the city consider in deciding where to encourage the most housing?
So we have a question from Brian, and I think here in the room also. Brian, did you raise your hand?
Yeah.
Okay, so Brian.
Yeah, and I apologize if this was already covered. Is there a key or a primer or like a summary that explains in any ranking system like this, the real key is how things are weighted, and I'm curious if, and then the rationale behind those weightings. Because if you change that, you can, I won't go further with it. So is that captured anywhere that could be distributed or already has been distributed to the group, and maybe I haven't looked at it?
Yeah, all that it'll be outlined in that equity and land use report. So yeah, we discussed in detail the data sources and any weighting we did in terms of when you're combining multiple indicators. So yeah, it's all laid out in there, and would be happy to accept your feedback or ideas on those.
Yeah, it's just something I'd like to be able to take a look at. It, what the weightings are, and if there's a simple explanation of the weighting, what the rationale was for the weightings. I think that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, yep, it's all in there.
On this slide here in particular, I'm surprised to see the minimal suitability in the lower Miller Creek, upper Miller Creek area. Is that because, I'm speculating it's just because there's one way in, one way out, and it's a transportation limitation for the suitability of development there? It's in the bottom left area. I'm assuming that's lower Miller Creek and it's yellow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's an elementary school out there, and then also with the investment of the Mullen Build project north of Mullen Road, I thought I'd see a lot more green out there, and you got Hellgate Elementary. And so I'm just kind of curious as to that, because if you go to your other slide, the North Reserve north of Mullen makes sense, but then it goes yellow, green, yellow. And that's kind of what we've historically in the last 5 years said that's where our highest and best bang for the buck for development is going to be. I don't, do you have any reasons why it goes orange, yellow, green, yellow?
Yeah, and so you're referring to kind of as you go south down Reserve?
No, right where you started with your cursor and then go west.
Yeah, I suspect Jamin can correct me, but it's a lot of those factors that feed in terms that are not development or infrastructure or transportation based as it applies to the economic and educational opportunity index. So that looks more at income levels, schools, testing scores at some of those schools, so some of those non-development based factors.
And I think it also has to be based, sorry, but I know Jamin probably has this too, but it has to be based on census data, I think. So it's got the people that are there now, or whatever your timeline was for gathering the information through census.
Historic.
Because you got the ranch
So-
club that's pretty affluent, and then you've got, 44 ranches turned into definitely an upper, I would say.
A few questions.
I think that's where you see that hop, right? You see from, more of like the downtown core and East Broadway and Orange to some suitability or lower moderate, and then you do jump to that high suitability kind of in some of those areas that are more developed out with some of those higher net worth, and then it jumped back to moderate. But yeah, that's interesting.
So a question on this particular map and the rationale for the yellow, green to yellow in the Mullen area. Could you provide a bit more background on the findings or the way you brought those, the way those indicators were identified?
Yeah, so I think trying to recall specifically what might be contributing to those scores there. But as it's combining multiple different data sources as well here. So what I imagine is probably showing here is that the yellow area kind of on the very western edge of the city is probably high. It's not it's scoring high probably on the employment rate, educational attainment, and lower poverty, I believe. So higher income in general and higher educational attainment. It may have just been skewed by some of the test scores at the schools or the graduation rates at the schools that then kicked it down into that moderate category. That's my recollection, but I couldn't answer it with any certainty. Yeah.
I heard nothing but good things about Hellgate Elementary, and it's K-8, so I would assume they'd have good test scores. But anyway, it's just because the difference in the Mullen Road area and the Lower Miller Creek area, specifically to this map, I would consider them equivalent. So some in the data seem to be skewing it at first blush.
Well, and it's a good question about going back to the equity report to figure out, is there some weighting in there that maybe doesn't make sense? And I think looking at the economic and educational opportunity index versus the prior index too, and thinking about what each of those tell us and which one maybe is the more informative or components of each that are more informative and telling us how we can and should build out, because I think you're right with the more historical view, the census data, that tells us where people might have more access to opportunity, but the suitability index might better tell us where opportunity for growth occurs, which is kind of the first piece, right? Where does opportunity for growth occur? Where is it suitable to grow? And then how do people fare with growth in those areas? So they're related, but they might tell us different things too. Yeah.
Hey, everybody, I just want to jump in with the time check. I think probably 3 or 5 more minutes on this before we transition to the next item to keep on track for the agenda today.
We have a question in the room, Chris.
More of a comment. I'm generally supportive of this sort of direction of analysis. I always get a little nervous when we take what has historically been and we create regulations and making sure that there's always room for neighborhoods to evolve in their suitability. And so, but that's just going to be a hobby horse of mine.
Yeah.
That's really good feedback. Yeah, well, we have one more question in the room.
Okay.
Can you go back 2 slides to suitability? That one, your 2 questions, that looks good to me. Center of the town, closest to services. The next one, I don't think we can put any more, should be putting much more housing in a place like Miller Creek because we don't have services. Everyone's stuck in a car. It's going to overload the transportation networks, makes it less you can't walk and bike really for your daily needs. Transit's tough there. So that first map makes a lot of sense. Now, if we factor in that we're going to do a lot of mixed use development in these places, then the equation starts to change in my mind.
So solely on residential, not so much. Right.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
Yeah, opportunities for mass transit expansion and where schools are out of capacity or half capacity are two other things that can, you know, be helpful. Like Rattlesnake Elementary, I know is under capacity. Hellgate is at max capacity and trying to figure out what they're going to do. And you know, expanding transit lines can be a relatively affordable thing at the civic level that can open up a lot of opportunities, particularly for it this way.
Great. So I want to keep us moving on to one more question on the equity and land use report. So another element of thinking about equity in land use is we know that new housing development in neighborhoods that are experiencing rising prices and rents, if that new housing development is concentrated in that neighborhood, it can actually have the effect of accelerating that appreciation in the neighborhood, which then leads to displacement of those lower income households, and in the long term, the potential for the overall kind of gentrification of that neighborhood. And so we looked at what are areas that are at risk for gentrification. And this is what this mapping shows here. So looking at a whole number of different indicators then to combine together and get a sense for, and the ones in yellow are the ones that are currently have a lot of populations that would be vulnerable to displacement. They likely would not be able to afford if rents or prices increase. And the ones in orange are places that have those populations, but are also seeing some significant appreciation in home prices and rents, which may be indicating of they're in the earlier stages of gentrification occurring. And so the implication for this in the equity and land use report is more housing overall is a good thing for affordability. But if that more housing is concentrated in only really occurring in neighborhoods that have populations that are vulnerable to being displaced, then it may have that unintended consequence of leading to the gentrification of those neighborhoods. Another idea here is that if kind of those neighborhoods are where all the pressure of the market is being served, then and there are not other places for new housing development to occur to take pressure off demand in those neighborhoods, that's what can lead to gentrification. And so we can use this mapping to try to anticipate and avoid concentrating new housing in these neighborhoods. So I guess the question here is like, does that idea make sense to you that the city should use this kind of mapping to try to avoid concentrating new housing in these neighborhoods? And then what does that imply for the areas that are marked as not vulnerable or not necessarily undergoing gentrification? So in gray in the rest of the city.
Put a thumbs up in the room.
Yeah. Makes sense. Next.
Seems to resonate with folks here. Are there any comments from virtual attendees.
So, do we know, just out of curiosity, do we know where people are being displaced to?
Frenchtown,
Minneapolis.
Clinton, Salt Lake City.
Did you hear that question also, Jamin?
Yeah, so on a citywide basis, if we look at if there are places, I think that's what you're asking. Are there people that are moving out of Missoula, and where are they moving to?
More specifically in the gentrification side of things, where, you know, if the people are being priced out, are they moving further out, or are there other neighborhoods that they're going to?
Yeah, that analysis could be done. We haven't done it for this project. I think primarily because we're concerned with where could future displacement occur. But I think it's an interesting question, but I'm not sure we have a good sense for it right now.
Anecdotally, through engagement, I do know folks are moving out to, you know, Bonner and the county, Ravalli, yeah. And then also, you know, it came up, I guess, in terms of like some of the goals around walkability, transportation, and climate. If folks are getting displaced into the county, then that's kind of pushing those issues further out as well. So just anecdotally, and I don't know off the top of my head like how many folks, but we did hear that a few times for sure.
And this also is related to our work around homelessness and affordable housing, and we've done some work there, and I can send a link out to the group after the meeting about a displacement analysis in our housing work. And so that's kind of a supplement to this, and is information that the team was that was made available to you, so we can send that out to you all.
And then online, I think Alan had a question.
I don't know that it's so much a question as it is a comment. You asked the question whether using these principles makes sense, and I think your comment was that the sense around the folks present is that a big thumbs up. And my comment to this is it makes sense in a vacuum. And if that 70-page equity report does not have a reality check of the market influences, the cost of development, the cost of acquiring land, the cost of building in any one of those locations, it's not a very useful report. And including these principles, if they are the driving force of determining the zoning, is not a very useful product of these principles. And I think of, thinking of the downtown, we can encourage all the housing we want downtown. Where's it going to go? I struggle with trying to figure out some of these locations where it's, you're not encouraging gentrification to occur. I struggle with seeing where any of it's going to go in some of those places. So certainly land use restrictions have historically had a very significant impact on equity issues, and it must be taken into consideration, particularly in a place like Missoula that values that discussion. But I will admit I'm struggling whether there's a proper balance going on in understanding how development actually occurs by the people doing it versus wanting to implement these principles.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah. So we have a member in the room, Chris.
I guess my response would be that at this point, the market is being pretty severely constrained. And so I'm not sure we actually know what the market wants in the way of residential development. And hopefully one of the outputs of this process is going to be a loosening so that we can see where that is. And if the market doesn't allow residential development in downtown, then there's no real harm to allowing it regulatorily. I think the point is we just need to release the constraints and understand a little more where it makes sense from a market perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all really great questions, and I appreciate that. And actually, it's a great segue to actually the next part of the agenda item here, because we are starting to ask that question: is if the code was changed, can the market respond? And would that actually have a tangible impact on the economic feasibility of development, which is very location specific. So we're going to also be incorporating that into the modeling we do in the later stages of the process. Just want to recognize that the market feasibility lens on this is something that we will be incorporating. It just hasn't got there yet.
So, Jamin, we've got a question in the chat, and we have Adam Hertz online as well. So I don't know if we could take a few quick questions and then shift over into conversation you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So, Adam?
Thank you. On the map that's currently up, I'm a little confused about the affordable and vulnerable area that is, I guess it would be partially Lewis and Clark, and I guess it'd be the Lewis and Clark area, the part there around Brooks and Russell.
Mm-hmm.
That strikes me as odd as an affordable area. It's actually a fairly expensive part of town, but it's definitely anecdotally seems pretty full of older people who have probably lived there for a very long time and are currently experiencing affordable living situations. But when homes resell there, they're quite expensive. So the other area that's affordable and vulnerable, totally understand and agree, and that does seem to be the case in that area. But I was just a little bit confused about that Lewis and Clark area being, I guess, considered affordable.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, I think that might be slightly skewed by concentration of Missoula Housing Authority units in that area around the Bancroft Pond.
That makes sense. Okay, that totally makes sense.
50 units in that area that I think is that.
Yeah, that's a good context here that a nuance we should add is that if there's a lot of those deed restricted units, then they are vulnerable to displacement in the fact that those are lower income households. But if they are currently in deed restricted units, then they are less vulnerable than people in market rate units. And so if that's skewing that neighborhood, that's a good little context we should keep in mind if we use this mapping in the future, that the populations in that neighborhood may be a little less vulnerable than the one if there are fewer units in other places that are deed restricted.
So I think I saw one more chat come in. Was that Leslie and Kat too or not? Leslie.
So I don't know how we're doing on time, Jamin, if those are ones we can answer in the chat, or if we have time to quickly go through those two and then.
I think we should move on pretty quick. I actually can't see the chat on my screen, so I can't answer them, but I could probably try to just get through them real quick. I think we want to get to the next item in the next couple of minutes, though.
Okay. Kat, do you want to address yours, or is yours more of a comment, just to kind of put on the record? Okay. That one looks like more of a comment, so I would encourage folks to go in there and read that and grab that context. I can read Leslie's here. It says, if they aren't in a hot housing market, wouldn't that drive up the home prices and motivate current landlords, in parentheses, owners, to sell, thus displacing the tenants? And wouldn't more housing in that neighborhood reduce pressure on the price?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, if they're not in a hot housing market, that doesn't mean, for example, the areas in yellow here, that that can't change very quickly. And because I think all of Missoula is a hot housing market in a certain way. And the question of, should we actually encourage more housing in that neighborhood so that it can relieve the pressure of demand on rents and prices on the existing units in that neighborhood? There's a lot to say for that idea. So we've reviewed that kind of academic research on whether new housing supply contributes to gentrification displacement or mitigates against it. And it's kind of inconclusive yet. And so we're kind of careful in describing whether or not new housing supply will actually reduce prices and rents or make them grow less quickly, or not. And so our conclusion from this is citywide new housing supply is a good idea. That is very well proven to reduce and mitigate increases in rents and prices. But if that new supply is concentrated only in certain neighborhoods, it may not have that effect of reducing prices in that neighborhood. And so I think the key idea here is it's not that we want to avoid new development in these neighborhoods, but it's that we don't want it to be the only place where new development happens.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good conclusion for now and segue into the code diagnostic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm super excited that we have another meeting next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to move into kind of a preview of the code diagnostic, and we wanted to start, especially today, just reinforcing how we're looking at the code and what the problem with the codes are. And so we sort of organized our analysis into three primary buckets. The substance of the code, right? How well did the codes implement adopted land development policies? The process, how well do the review and approval process provide for predictable and fair and timely decisions? And then finally, the overall organization and user friendliness of the code, right? How well do the codes communicate what the expectations are? How clear is it? How easy it is to understand it and to navigate the code. So we're just going to give you a little bit of preview of one of the substantive issues, which is top of people's mind, of course, and that has to do with housing capacity. And what we're going to share with you today is, again, it's mostly about what the method is that we use to evaluate how the code affects housing supply, feasibility of development, and affordability. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jamin, and he's going to talk about the code barriers to housing production and introduce an idea about what we call levers. But the main thing is recognizing that the barriers that exist in the code today are the things that we turn into levers to figure out how to improve on feasibility, housing capacity, and affordability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and this is getting right into that question of how would the code actually affect the feasibility of development, the kinds of housing that are developed, and so on. And so I think the key idea here is, so we know there are some of these barriers to housing development. They've been identified before. We've heard a lot from the development community, things like minimum parking requirements, maximum density, minimum setbacks, minimum landscape and activity area. So those are barriers, definitely, but some of them also have underlying purposes that are important to consider. And so is with any zoning code, we probably can't just remove all of the barriers and simply let development happen. That's not going to be, I think, acceptable to the community at large. And so we think about them as levers in terms of what levers should we pull and how much do we have to pull it to get the outcomes we want
in terms of housing. And so we did a little testing of this here to kind of show you the kind of analysis that we will do, and that will help us make decisions about what kinds of code changes are most appropriate. So we looked at the RM 145 zone, which is a multifamily zone. This is where it's mapped to. Some areas on the west side and north side of Missoula, generally pretty close in. This is one of the highest density multifamily zones that the city has. And so what are those levers in that zone to impacting housing outcomes? And so these are the key ones that we've identified that have the biggest impact on feasibility, housing affordability, other outcomes. So minimum lot area per unit, this is effectively the maximum density. So this is the minimum amount of land you need to have on your site for every dwelling unit that you have. And it's 1,000 square feet in this zone. It's a maximum of 4 stories today. The parking ratio usually comes out to something like 1.5 spaces per unit. It can be a little lower if you have smaller units. Setbacks are the front and the side, or in the rear, are 20. They're a little bit smaller on the sides, but just for simplification, we use 20 here. And there's a minimum landscaping requirement, which is 35% of the site. And this portion of that needs to be specifically activity area. And so that also impacts what you can build and how much you can build. So we do some modeling. So we do these kind of test fit, or these we call them test fits, but they're basically a 3D SketchUp model, which takes a typical building and you apply all those standards to it and try to get an estimate of how many units can you fit on a site. And later we'll show you we actually do financial pro forma analysis to understand how much would those units need to generate in rent or prices for that development to be considered economically feasible by a private market developer. So here's what is possible under the existing code standards. You're maxed out at 32 units because of the minimum lot area per unit standard in the code. But this project meets all the standards of the code. You got 32 units on the site. You've got parking at about 1 to 1.5 spaces per unit. You have some activity area, which is shown in dark green. It meets the setbacks. This is the kind of form of multifamily apartments you're likely to see in this zone. This site is about a little under an acre. Here's how that performs financially. And so what the chart on the right shows is what is the minimum feasible rent so what would need to be charged in rent for that project to be economically feasible. So that blue dot there is showing that minimum rent needs to be somewhere in the $2,500, a little bit over $2,500 average per unit for that project to be economically feasible. That's above what we consider or what we've seen to be the market rent range in Missoula. And this is for a typical 800 square foot units. This is just kind of an average unit size of 1,400 to 2,200. So the first finding is that that rent is pretty high for that unit for that project to be feasible. And secondly, it's probably not feasible now in most places because developers may not think that they can lease up the whole building at those rents of $2,700, $2,500 per unit. So not a great outcome so far. What if we made some changes? So we looked at what if we reduced required parking? And if we just changed parking, so we don't change any of the other standards, that's the lever we pull, we don't pull anything else. You're able to get to 30, you're still stuck at 32 units because of that minimum lot area per unit. And so you can provide less parking on the site, but the building can't get any bigger, more units can't be added because you're stuck at 32 units in order to meet that minimum lot area per unit. So it's just a good test that if we pull the parking lever, then we also have to pull other levers probably for it to really have an impact. Some zones that's not the case, but in most of the multifamily zones, there's a maximum density which would limit you actually adding more units, even if you provided less parking on the site. So again, still 32 units. Because you have less parking, the cost of development is a little bit lower. So that minimum feasible rent in that lighter blue dot comes down a little bit. So you're maybe at a little bit under 2,500. you're still out of the range, which is probably the market rents. So that's probably a project not a lot of developers are going to want to take on unless it's in a good location and you have high-end units and so on. So what if we reduce the minimum parking and reduce that minimum lot area per unit? So we run that through the model and try to see how many units could you fit and how could you configure that on the site in order to maximize the density on the site, given those levers that we pulled. So we didn't change the maximum height of the building. We didn't change the minimum setbacks. We didn't change the minimum landscaping and activity area. That's all still the same. We just changed the minimum parking, minimum lot area per unit. So we're still meeting all those other code standards. We had a pretty significant impact on how many units can be built. So we have 52 units now on this site. And primarily because you're not limited to that maximum density or minimum lot area per unit. And then here's how that building performs financially. So we're getting closer to would be considered a market feasible rent. So that rent is probably down more close to 2,200. That's still a pretty high rent and something that's only going to be affordable to higher income Missoulians or moderate to higher income Missoulians, as we've shown here on this chart. But it's a positive improvement. So the benefits of that increased density, you're getting more units over that same cost of land. That's allowing you to charge less per unit. So lastly, what if we reduce parking, minimum lot area per unit, setbacks, and landscaping? And so this is a bit of an example of what if we pulled many different levers. And so here now you get up to 64 units on the site. So you have a few less parking spaces, you have a smaller amount of landscaping, a little bit tighter setbacks that allows you to extend the floor plate of the building and really maximize the density on the site. Again, another jump here in terms of being able to deliver those units at a rent that is more in line with what the market will bear and a positive impact on feasibility. So that gives you a sense for how we kind of try to evaluate what kinds of levers should we pull. But then we have to also ask the question, okay, if we pulled all those levers in this zone, citywide and more at a broader policy scale, what kind of impact would that have on our goals for this project? And so we went through this process of thinking about this as kind of a report card. So we have these different goals. What grade do we give it on those goals? So in terms of housing supply, we would give this an A. This is a 100% increase in the achievable density on that site. We went from 32 to 64 units. And in those units are more feasible for a developer to build. So it's not just theoretical density at that point, but it may be actually density that a developer could deliver those units at a market feasible rent. And so they're more likely to actually get built as well. There's a significant amount of land in the RM 145 zone to build on. In terms of housing affordability, we would actually give this kind of a B. So it has it did decrease the minimum rents needed for that project to pencil, yet those rents would still not be affordable to lower income households. And so again, those very low income or low income households, if this is the only change, you're going to get a lot more new market rate housing supply, but those lower income households and very low income households are unlikely to afford those units. Now, there may be benefits longer term in terms of adding more supply, and those lower income households would benefit from the reduced pressure in the market. That could also happen, but they won't benefit from that new development indirectly. And so one other question here is, the city currently has some incentives for development to include income restricted units, and those income restricted units would serve those lower income households. But we didn't pull those levers in here. So those are the levers shown in orange here. So which would be the minimum percentage of affordable units that are required, or that are required to access a certain level of density, and the maximum area median income for those affordable units. And so that's another lever that can be pulled, is how affordable do the units we want the units to be, and how many or what percentage of the whole units in the site need to be deed restricted affordable. So we didn't pull those here, but that's another thing the city needs to consider is what is the balance between the base level of density we want to allow and enable versus the bonus density that could be accessed if a development includes income restricted units. So we give it a B on housing affordability. We look at equity, and particularly spatial equity, we actually give it a pretty low grade of a C. So as we look at if this code change, this was implemented in isolation, you would likely be having the impact that we just discussed related to the gentrification risk areas, which is that the RM145 zone is mapped to a lot of areas that have been identified as potentially vulnerable to gentrification. So if you look at this in isolation and we only change the RM145 zone, or if you only change the multi-dwelling zones or the commercial zones, the outcome of that is likely that it's going to concentrate new housing development in those areas that are vulnerable to displacement. And that's the outcome that the researchers shown would be more likely to accelerate displacement. So it's not clear to us that implementing this kind of change to one zone or one set of zones is what is necessary to try to make sure this is an equitable outcome in the future, and that new housing development isn't concentrated only in certain neighborhoods. So lastly, in terms of form and character, so this project has to consider multiple goals, not just housing and equity, but also, well, what does that development look like and how does it fit in with its surroundings and the existing development? So it's positive because we're not seeing an increase in building heights. So that is probably we're going to make it more compatible with a variety of neighborhoods. But the RM145 zone is mapped to neighborhoods that have a very different character. And so the question remains there, would those code changes enable a form and intensity of development that is compatible with these varying neighborhoods and their varying existing character? And if not, then are there ways that we can try to adjust those standards to make sure that that new development would be more compatible while also achieving our housing goals? And so this is, again, speaks to importance of we're just looking at the code and in this kind of hypothetical test, but that code is mapped to a lot of different places. Those places have different characteristics. And when we're thinking about code changes, sometimes it's important to think not just about the code and changing that and applying that universally, but that we might want to tailor the changes by also changing the zoning map and allowing having some something that is more responsive to that context of the character of the neighborhood. Okay, that was a lot, and I tried to go through it fast. So let's just pause there and see what questions you have on this analysis.
Looks like Adam's got his hand up.
Thanks. That was a great analysis, and you know, a lot of it kind of meets my experience on the ground. I probably mostly do small to medium scale multifamily infill development. The challenge being, you know, best case scenario for that is usually like a 12 unit building, like on a couple of lots. So I think the difficulty is, where are we ever going to find a vacant acre of land in the RM145 zoning district? And unfortunately, the answer to that has pretty much only been, you know, trailer parks right now. So then we're eliminating affordable housing, you know, to build maybe slightly less affordable housing. So I think, you know, I think it's incredibly important that we would look at map amendments, you know, in looking at like the bottom picture on the slide that's up there right now, where it's kind of a more suburban development pattern. And there are occasionally vacant, half acre pieces of land kind of on those suburban areas or urban fringe areas. Those are, in my experience, the areas that are probably more likely to be able to fit this scale of development. Otherwise, we're looking at analysis that probably would be more like, 4 plexes or something rather than 64 units.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to note too that for when we go through this process for all of the zone districts, we have done, we will do a version that's a smaller infill lot and a version that's a bigger lot. And this is the bigger lot version. It's helpful just to see what's happening on the site a little bit better. But that's part of the testing as well is, okay, this works on an acre lot, but things like parking and setbacks and landscaping have actually a greater impact on a smaller lot where you're more constrained. And so we will test that as well and make sure we're trying to create a pathway for a feasible development on those smaller infill lots.
One quick question. On that slide where you had the grades, did you say you think Missoula has enough RM 145, significant amount of land in RM 145? I mean, just at first blush looking at the map, it didn't look like a lot of area, but was your conclusion that you think it's appropriately an amount of land is square footage or area is appropriate the way it sits now?
Yeah, no, not necessarily. So I think the point I was just trying to make there is just that even if you don't change the map, would this actually have much of an impact? And compared to other zones in the city, this zone is mapped to a lot of properties. There are some zones that are just mapped to very few properties, and so just changing the code for those zones doesn't have much of an impact. So that was mostly what I was referring to here. But in terms of the question of do we have enough land zoned in different zone districts to meet our housing needs and to have enough housing capacity, that is part of the analysis we will be going through with a scenarios process. And so we'll consider not just the total amount of land that's zoned, but actual buildable land that is in each of these zones. And so land that's not already developed and either would be considered vacant or like very underutilized. And we'll also look at redevelopment capacity, which will use an economic indicator to measure which properties may be feasible for redevelopment. And so that'll all be taken into account, and we'll have an estimate of, do we have enough capacity in different zone districts and for different housing types?
Chris?
I have one quibble, I think, with the assumptions on your affordability criteria for your scoring, which is, I only bring up because I hear it a lot, and that's the sort of the filtering aspect. Obviously, there's the first order effects of building, well, like big A affordable housing, but I think I just want to push back and say that if you build 64 units of market rate housing, that the downstream effects are pretty large, and I think there's research to support that, and I just want that to be disseminated broadly.
Yeah. That's a great point, and I think that's part of the key policy question and decision is the city how much do they want to pull the lever to enable market rate supply with the hope that then does filter down and it benefit lower income households, which I think you're correct that there's a lot of research to show that actually that does happen. But how much do they want to also try to make sure there's new developments include some percentage of affordable units? And that's a key policy question that we're expecting to kind of tackle in the next couple phases of the work.
And then one follow-up, you sort of like referred to, I think it's a surplus ratio or just sort of like the total amount of developable units that are theoretically possible, do you target a certain ratio for that? Because I know people have done studies and we can see that in places where building is easy, that ratio of what I'm calling surplus ratio is right. Seems like there's trends that are trackable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. It's definitely not a complete science yet on that, but I think so. The methodology that we'll use and we'll get to eventually is, so the city does have and will have estimates of future housing need. So looking at population growth and household formation and vacancy rates and so on, you can say we need this many new housing units in the next 20 years. And so we will use that as our kind of target or our benchmark for, does the code allow that many housing units? The question is likely yes, theoretically yes. But how much more do you need to make sure you have enough capacity to respond to that demand? Because having a 1-to-1 ratio of your capacity to your need is likely not a good idea. And so we typically recommend 1.5 to 1, even 2 to 1, because there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not that housing capacity theoretically gets built, and you want to have that surplus to rely on. So we haven't landed on a specific ratio, but we will report that out, and so that when we look at these different scenarios of code changes, you could compare one set of changes produces maybe a capacity of 125% of the need. Another one is 150% of the need, and that's part of the evaluation. That seems like to me like I'm going from memory here, but the numbers like really unconstrained markets seem like they're up in the 4 to 1. Is that, I could be wrong. Yeah, I think it all depends on how you're measuring the capacity, and sometimes the theoretical capacity is way higher than what's actually achievable, and so sometimes the density that you theoretically could achieve under the code is just not achievable if you're also meeting all the other standards of the code. So that could be part of the reason that those seem high. But so we'll report it out in both of those forms, so you'll be able to see theoretical capacity versus like realistic capacity.
So it sounds like this is something we're going to be continuing to talk about, and I just want to do a time check. We only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and we need to wrap up, talk about next steps. There's one question, one person who has their hand raised. Heather, is it?
Yep. I can be quick.
Thank you.
I was just going to reinforce what we were talking about. I had this conversation in Great Falls last week. Right now, we're at a stagnant, nobody can make a lateral move, and the whole market is clogged, and it's because of lack of available units. I think that this is probably one of the most useful analysis I've heard in a long time, because it is all about the code. You guys will get a litmus test of what's right now, but I think that these should be rerun on a routine basis, because capital A, affordable will always be a need, but so will all the other housing types. And it'd be nice to know with some of the zoning choices and where we are, how we're doing and how that changes over time. I just would love to see how that actually plays out in reality versus in the report. But I do like the analysis, and looking forward to seeing the calculations Adam referenced and you said that you were going to do on the smaller lots. So overall, this is really great. And I would love to get a copy of this report.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's bring it back to Sam and is that okay, or did you have more? Yeah, what's next? Thank you. There's just a conversation about what's next and reminder of the next meeting.
Thanks, Laval. And we anticipated there was going to be a lot of discussion today, which is why we proactively scheduled one next week too. And just to touch on where we've been. So we've been talking about defining the problem, both with the code and the growth policy. So We've been working a lot behind the scenes on the equity and land use report, which we talked a bit more about today. We brought some initial analysis around community form to this group earlier this year when we started introducing the concept of place types and existing place types and the existing patterns and character we're seeing throughout the city today. We've been diving deep into what's currently wrong with the code. We're going through this process of auditing the code. So we're rolling these three buckets together to define the problem with the code so we can have a robust conversation around really what are we trying to solve with the code. Next slide, Jamin. So that's really where we've been in terms of defining the problem. And then next slide. And so where we're going and where this is leading to is starting to talk about the scenarios for the future. So what does that mean? So how can Missoula change to respond to some of these issues we're seeing? Where do we want to calibrate some code changes to incentivize or at least make it easy for people to do the development we want to see? So this will entail more prototype analysis that Jamin shared and touching on both the large developments and those small infill developments that he talked about. But then Cascadia will also look at that from a citywide analysis. What does that mean for overall housing capacity? So that's where we're going to get into testing some future growth scenarios and diving into where does this change make sense and what does that change look like for the scenarios for the future. Next slide. So what is next with this group in the immediate future? Next week, we'll continue discussing some of our initial findings from the code diagnostic. We'll dive a little deeper into form and process and some more of those substantive issues. Again, building on this. So if anything comes up for you guys over this next week, we'll definitely have time next week to dive deeper and talk more about all of this. And as Laval mentioned, this is all starting to build on each other too. So this is really the beginning of this conversation. We're going to continue to dive deeper into some of the market testing and then start to look at that from a form perspective too, because we want to make sure that we're meeting the housing needs while still keeping what's special about Missoula today. So what that will look like is that's when we're going to dive into the future scenario in upcoming meetings. So that'll be later this winter is when we'll start to have those conversations with you guys. Again, that's the citywide capacity analysis. And then that's when we'll talk a bit more about the future place types. Again, how much change are we going to see for these different areas? And I think that's it for next steps. Ben, was there anything you wanted to say before we wrap up, or Laval?
I do just have a quick scheduling related plug that I've sent out a survey in some of the last emails that have gone out to the group, and just following the meeting next week, which will be in the same room by the way, and at the same time, so Friday at 10 o'clock. But following that, we're looking around for some other available times for this group. So it'd be great if for those of you who have not had a chance yet to respond to that survey and just get a sense of what might work, that would be great. And I think, just so you know, the next regularly scheduled meeting we have is the week of Thanksgiving. We're planning on not using that time and either moving that meeting to the week before or potentially to the week after. So we haven't quite landed on that yet, but just want to communicate that, and we'll be follow up with more details as we confirm. Thanks.
Can you confirm we'll be able to get these slides out to folks in the next day or two, today or Monday, so they can spend some time with them before next Friday?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get the slides out. Probably the slides and we'll get those out early, and then the recording, it takes a few days to get posted, but we should have that available a few days at least before the next meeting as well.
And it sounded like there might have been some issues with people being able to open the survey or the questionnaire. Is this the one you were thinking of?
Yeah,
Brian?
I don't know if other people are having that problem. I can't remember what it
So
told me.
we'll need to circle back on that. If you reach out to Ben, if you're having a challenge with the questionnaire,
Yeah, and in general, there's always room if you have follow-up comments or thoughts or questions that came out of this conversation that you want to pick back up on, at our next meeting. It's really helpful for us to know that and be able to kind of build that into these. So don't hesitate to send that out to me or this group.
All right, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you. See you next week.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.